Okay, we're going to do a pre-recording for the next reading. S.I. Benn and R.S. Peters, Human Action and the Limitations of Causal Explanation. This is the last piece, the last excerpt that we have to read for this section of the class. Determinism, to a scientist, conveys the general proposition that every event has a cause. Whether this general proposition is true is a very difficult question to decide, but it is certainly assumed to be true by most scientists. To say that an event has a cause is to say that there are universal laws together with statements about initial conditions prevailing at particular times, and that from these two together we can predict an event which we call an effect. For example, given that under the conditions X, Y, Z, iron expands when it is heated, and given that the conditions X, Y, Z prevail, and that this is a case of iron being heated, we can make the prediction that iron will expand. Here we have a typical causal relation. The so-called cause is that the event referred to in the statement of initial the so-called cause is then the event referred to in the statement of initial conditions. And these conditions are regarded as being sufficient to explain the effect. If it is a full-blooded causal explanation, have we such relations in human affairs? The initial difficulty about saying that we have is that it is difficult to maintain that there are any psychological or sociological laws which would enable us to make such definite predictions. There are also difficulties connected with our knowledge of particular situations which constitute the initial conditions. For when we are dealing with stones and bodies falling, their past history is scarcely part of the present situation. But when we are dealing with human beings, their past history is very much part of the present situation. And it is very difficult to know whether a given case is really of the type to which the particular law we have in mind applies. Nevertheless, there are some generalizations in psychology and the social sciences which are reasonably well established. They do not enable us to make detailed predictions. Why is this thing clicking? No, let's just read. I thought we were going to keep reading. They do not enable us to make detailed predictions. They merely enable us to state the sort of thing that will tend to happen under certain typical conditions. In this respect, psychology is in no worse plight than other sciences, like meteorology. The difficulties arise from the complexity of the subject matter and, it might be argued, can be remedied in time. If, however, we look more closely at these so-called laws in psychology, we find, in the main, that they do not give sufficient explanations of human actions, of what human beings do deliberately, knowing what they are doing and for which they can give reasons. Freud's brilliant discoveries, for instance, were not of the causes of actions like signing contracts or shooting pheasants. Rather, they were of things that happen to a man, like dreams, hysteria, and slips of the tongue. These might be called passions, more appropriately than actions, and in this respect they are similar to what we call fits of passion, or gusts of emotion. Men do not dream or forget a name on purpose, any more than they are deliberately subject to impulses or gusts of emotion. One class of laws in psychology, then, gives causal explanations which seem sufficient to account for what happens to a man, but not for what he does. There's another class of laws, however, which concern not what happens to a man, but what not what happens to men, but what they do, their actions, performances, and achievements. But such laws state necessary rather than sufficient conditions. We have in mind here the contributions made by physiological psychologists and those who have studied cognitive skills like learning, remembering, and perceiving. Part of what we mean by such terms is that human beings attain a norm or standard. Hey, Normie, Normie. Hey, wake up. How you doing, baby? He was having a nightmare. Sorry. Part of what we mean by such terms is that human beings attain a norm or standard. Remembering is not just a psychological process, for to remember is to be correct about what happened in the past. Knowing is not just a mental state. It is to be sure that we are correct and to have good grounds for our conviction. To perceive something is to be right in our claims about what is before our eyes. To learn something is to improve at something or to get something right. All such concepts have norms written into them. In a similar way, as we have previously argued, a human action is typically something done in order to bring about a result or in accordance with a standard. Such actions can be said to be done more or less intelligently and more or less correctly, only because of the norms defining what are ends and what are efficient and correct means to them. It follows that a psychologist who claims that such performances depend on antecedent psychological conditions or mental processes can at the most be stating necessary conditions. For processes of themselves are not appropriately described as correct or incorrect, intelligent or stupid. They only become so in the context of standards laid down by men. As Protagoras taught, nature knows no norms. It may well be true that a man cannot remember without part of his brain being stimulated, or that learning is a function, in part, of antecedent tension. But the very meaning of remembering and learning precludes a sufficient explanation in these sorts of naturalistic terms. Furthermore, the problem of the freedom of the will arose mainly in connection with a type of action that is palpably different from a mere movement or process, an action that is preceded by deliberation and choice. For, roughly speaking, a willed action was usually taken to mean one in which we think before we act, when we make up our minds in terms of considerations which are relevant to the matter in hand before we act. There are difficulties about developing causal laws for actions of this type, which are additional to those already stated about actions in general. Such difficulties are similar to those with which the social scientist, as well as the psychologist, has in predicting what human beings will do. This is connected with the fact that into the human being's deliberations about what he is going to do will be introduced considerations about what he is likely to do, which the social scientist may have published. A scientist may discover a causal law connecting the properties of clover with a certain effect upon the digestive organs of sheep. But when he publishes his findings, the sheep cannot take account of them and modify their behavior accordingly. But with men, it is different. Many causal connections discovered by psychologists may only hold good provided that the people whose actions are predicted in accordance with the law remain ignorant of what it asserts. And it is practically impossible to ensure that this is the case. So, if people know the causes on which a prediction of a certain type of behavior is based, and if they deliberate before acting, they may do something different from what is predicted just because they recognize these causes. A prediction may thus be valid only on the assumption that the people concerned remain unconscious of the causes on which it is based. Otherwise, it may be no more than a warning. But why cannot causal explanations also be given of such informed deliberations which precede actions? We are here confronted with the difficulty of accounting for logical thought in causal terms, of giving a causal explanation for rational actions done after deliberation, which involves logically relevant considerations. This is an extreme case of the difficulty already cited in giving sufficient explanations in causal terms for actions and performances which involve norms and standards. Yet, as has already been pointed out, such premeditated actions are particularly important in the free will controversy, as the exercise of will has usually been associated with rational deliberation before acting. When a man is solving a geometrical problem and his thoughts are proceeding in accordance with certain logical canons, it is logically absurd to suggest that any causal explanation in terms of movements in his brain, his temperament, his bodily state, and so on is sufficient by itself to explain the movement of his thought. For logical canons are normative and cannot be sufficiently explained in terms of states and processes which are not. Of course, there are any number of necessary conditions which must be taken account of. A man cannot think without a brain, for instance. But any sufficient explanation would have to take account of the reasons for his actions. We would have to know the rules of chess, for instance, which gave some point to a chess player's move. Indeed, we would only ask for the cause of a chess player's behavior if he did something which could not be explained in terms of the rules of chess and the objective at which he was aiming. If, for instance, he refrained from taking an opponent's queen when this was the obvious and the best move, we might ask, what made him do that? And we would be asking for a causal explanation, like he was tired. And this would now be an explanation of what happened to him, not of what he did deliberately. We would not ask for such an explanation if there was an obvious reason for his move. Of course, the category of action is much wider than that of premeditated action, though it may be coextensive with that of rationality. For this covers the sort of things for which a man could have a reason, i.e., which fall under what we call the purposive rule-following model. Premeditated action is a particular case of action where action is preceded by rehearsals and deliberation, but often reasons can be given by people for what they do, even though they do not deliberate before they act. That was a footnote. This example, the chess one, can be generalized in the point made that behavior is usually explicable, not because we know its causes, but because people act in accordance with certain known rules and conventions and adopt appropriate means to objectives which are accepted as legitimate goals. We know why a person is mounting the pulpit, not because we know much about the causes of his behavior, but because we know the conventions governing church services. We would only ask what were the causes of his behavior if he fainted when he peered out over the congregation, or if something similar happened to him. Most of our explanations of human behavior are couched in terms of the purposive rule-following model, not in causal terms. Moral behavior, above all other sorts, falls into this purposive rule-following category. For, as Aristotle put it, it is not a man's passions which are the object of moral appraisal, nor his capacity to be subject to such passions. Rather, we praise or blame a man for what he does about his passions, for the extent to which he controls or fails to control them in various situations. Deliberation and choice may not precede every action, but habits are set up as a result of such deliberation and choice. It is for the exercise of such habits that men are praised and blamed. for the ends which they seek and for the means which they adopt to bring about their ends. Punishment, too, presupposes that men can foresee the consequences of their actions, and that they can learn to avoid those to which penalties are attached. Praise and blame, reward and punishment act as rudders to steer human actions precisely because men deliberate and choose and can be influenced by considerations of consequences. There is a radical difference between actions of this sort and cases where things happen to a man, where he acts on impulse, has a dream, a vision, or lapse of memory, or where he is afflicted by a feeling of nausea or hysterical paralysis. Questions of the freedom of the will do not arise where things happen to a man, only where a man acts and can be praised or blamed, punished or rewarded for what he does. Yet it is precisely in these cases of human actions, as distinct from passions, that causal explanations seem inappropriate as sufficient explanations. Two sorts of objections might be mounted against this attempt to limit the role of causal explanations of human behavior. In the first place, it might be said that by substituting concepts like rule following and the pursuit of objectives, we were in fact introducing other sorts of causes. Now, the word cause can be used in this very wide sense, but the terminological question is largely irrelevant, for two sorts of explanations, which are logically quite different, would then be included under the enlarged concept of cause. To follow rules, to take steps which are seen to be necessary to reach some sort of objective, to see the point of something. These may be causes, but they are not causes but they are causes in quite a different sense of cause, from things like stomach contractions, brain lesions, acute pains, and so on. The types of explanation must be distinguished, whether we use the term cause to cover both or not. And certainly seeing the point of something is quite different, even if it is called a cause, from the causes prevalent in the physical world. In the early days of the determinist controversy, philosophers like Spinoza and Kant used the term self-determined to distinguish rational actions from those which could be explained in terms of mechanical causes, like movements of the brain and body. Indeed, Kant's suggestion that man lives in two worlds and is subject to two different sorts of causation is a metaphysical way of bringing out the logical distinction between those two sorts of explanation. The second objection is the suggestion that all reasons might be rationalizations, a smokescreen for what we are going to do anyway. We are, as it were, pushed by causes in the mechanical, physical sense, whatever we do. But sometimes we throw up an elaborate smokescreen of excuses which make no difference to what we in fact do. If, however, we say that all reasons are rationalizations, we make no difference between the behavior of an obsessive or a compulsive and that of a rational man. If a compulsive believes that his hands are covered in blood and spends his time continually washing them, no relevant considerations will make any difference to his behavior. All the known tests fail to show blood, yet he still goes on washing his hands. But a civil servant making a complex decision about policy does not proceed like this. He will change his mind and alter policy in the light of relevant considerations. Really not. Indeed, it is only because people sometimes alter their behavior because of relevant considerations that it makes any sense to talk of rationalizations as well as of reasons. A term like rationalization, which casts aspersions on the reasons given for action, is a verbal parasite. It flourishes because there are cases of genuine reasons with which rationalizations can be contrasted. Thus, even if all behavior has causes, in the sense of necessary conditions. There are objections to saying that all behavior, especially rational behavior, can be sufficiently explained by causes of the sort suggested by physical scientists and by mechanistic philosophers like Hobbes. That's being recorded now, but it is for Thursday's class after we do Hospers on Tuesday. I will see you there, and we will talk about those. There's a couple of very interesting arguments in there. We'll talk about it on Thursday.